The North Atlantic was a graveyard in the winter of 1942, a place where ships vanished not into storms, but under the crosshairs of unseen U-boats. That was why Chief Petty Officer Samuel Briggs froze in disbelief as the freighter beside his seemed to melt into the horizon, its sharp outline softening, blurring, and finally dissolving into the shimmering fog drifting across the waves. One moment it was a steel hull, the next, nothing but rippling water. A low hiss rose from the metal cylinders bolted along his own ship's rails. The fog poured out in rolling sheets, clinging to the sea instead of rising into the sky. Sunlight struck the ship's strange reflective coating and bounced outward in fractured glints, making the vessel appear like a flicker of pale light sliding across mist. From a distance, it no longer looked like a ship at all. This was the first real test of Dr. Harold Whitcombe's classified horizon blending system, part camouflage, part atmospheric illusion, designed to erase convoys from enemy optics. Documentary notes from the Admiralty confirm that these early trials combined experimental reflective paints with chemically generated vapor meant to distort periscope sightlines. But as the fog thickened, Samuel inhaled and felt a burn deep in his chest. The vapor that hid them was not as harmless as promised. Before we go deeper, make sure to like this video and subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering the wartime secrets history tried to bury. And keep watching, because what happened next proved the fog could hide almost anything, including the danger waiting inside it. Long before Samuel Briggs watched a freighter disappear beside him, the British Admiralty had already begun searching for a way to defeat the U-boats without firing a single shot. By the early years of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic was draining the nation's lifelines. Submarines struck under cover of darkness, relying on periscope silhouettes, horizon contrast, and faint glints of metal to find their targets. If the Royal Navy could break those visual cues, even slightly, convoys might live long enough to reach port. That task fell to a small research branch in Portsmouth. Their work focused on optical camouflage, drawing on early experiments with horizon-matching paints, reflective coatings, and artificial haze. Internal papers from 1942 describe a radical concept. If a ship could blend into the very line where ocean meets sky, it would effectively disappear from a periscope's view. Enter Dr. Harold Whitcombe, a physicist with a background in atmospheric scattering. He proposed combining two components: a reflective coating that distorted incoming light, softening the ship's outline, and a chemical fog that hugged the water's surface instead of drifting upward, bending visibility at long range. Together, they formed a moving curtain of misdirection, one the Admiralty hoped would confuse enemy optics and frustrate torpedo crews. But the science that promised invisibility carried risks no laboratory test could fully expose. What the sea trial would reveal went far beyond anything written in Whitcombe's technical reports. At the Portsmouth test yard, Dr. Harold Whitcombe stood beside the first hull coated in his reflective mixture, watching sunlight scatter across the surface in broken flashes. The paint didn't shine like metal. It muted the ship's shape, bending light just enough to blur the transition between steel and sky. When observers viewed it through a mock periscope positioned a kilometer away, the hull no longer appeared as a solid object, but as a faint disturbance on the horizon. The second component, the fog, proved even more dramatic. In controlled dock trials, Whitcombe's chemical compound released a vapor that drifted laterally across the water rather than rising vertically. Atmospheric tests showed that its density created a mirage-like effect, producing the illusion of open water where the ship actually stood. Admiralty documents from 1942 noted that the vapor's refractive properties interfered with depth perception, making range estimation unreliable for any submarine officer looking through a narrow scope. But early demonstrations also exposed a darker side. Engineers tasked with installing the generators reported stinging eyes, burning throats, and sudden headaches after only minutes inside the vapor cloud. A few collapsed during prolonged exposure. These warnings were marked operational tolerances and filed away for later review. Samuel Briggs witnessed the final dockside demonstration before deployment. The moment the fog rolled out, the ship in front of him dissolved into a shimmering patch of empty sea. Astonishing, yet every sailor beside him coughed as if the air had turned against them. Admiralty officials ignored those signs. They believed the real test could only happen miles from shore, where failure meant nothing short of disaster. The convoy left Liverpool under grey skies, engines thudding in a slow, disciplined rhythm as the ships formed their long defensive column. Chief Petty Officer Samuel Briggs knew only the basics of the new system: reflective hull treatment, experimental fog units, classified orders. He didn't need more. Orders in wartime rarely came with explanations. 2 days into the crossing, the message arrived from the lead escort: activate generators. Within minutes, the hissing began. Vapor spilled across the decks, sliding down ladders, pooling around boots, and drifting into the open sea like a silver veil. The ships ahead transformed one by one. Their outlines faded, their colors muted, until they resembled wavering shapes, half water, half mirage. From above, aircraft spotters later reported seeing patches of distorted horizon where ships should have been. Periscope logs captured after the war showed confused U-boat officers attempting to range-find targets that appeared to shimmer or collapse into empty water. Torpedoes launched at what looked like a hull instead streaked into fog and detonated against nothing. But below deck, reality was harsher. The vapor infiltrated ventilation shafts and storage rooms. Samuel felt the burn first, a sharp scratch in the throat that grew into a relentless cough. Others clutched their chests, eyes watering, breath shallow. Still, the convoy pressed on, hidden from the enemy yet trapped inside the very cloud protecting them. By the time the fog thickened into a moving wall, Samuel understood the truth: the system worked flawlessly. What he didn't yet know was how high the price would climb before they reached land. By the time the convoy reached the outer approaches to Halifax, the fog generators had finally gone silent. The moment fresh air drifted across the decks, men collapsed against railings, coughing so violently it echoed between the ships. Chief Petty Officer Samuel Briggs leaned over a bucket, his breath rattling, flecks of dark red spattering the metal. Others fared worse. 2 engineers on a nearby freighter were carried out unconscious, their lungs filling with fluid from repeated exposure to the chemical vapor. Medical teams boarded as soon as the mooring lines were tied off. Their reports, filed quietly that same evening, recorded acute respiratory distress, blistered bronchial tissue, chemical inflammation of the airways, and, in several cases, early signs of pneumonitis. Admiralty officials compared these findings with the results of earlier dockside tests and realized the pattern was identical, only magnified by days of continuous exposure in the open Atlantic. Dr. Harold Whitcombe received the full field dossier weeks later. His notes shifted from enthusiasm to alarm. He wrote that the fog compound's dispersal behavior made it tactically brilliant but physiologically catastrophic. In a wartime margin annotated in pencil, an officer summarized the conclusion bluntly: effective for concealment, unsafe for crew, terminate development. The official outcome was swift and silent. The project was classified, the generators pulled from service, and the formula sealed away. No public explanation, no acknowledgement to the men who breathed it. And yet the story was not over, not for the survivors who carried the fog's damage long after the war ended. Samuel Briggs never forgot the taste of that fog. Long after the war ended, long after his uniform was folded into a drawer, he still felt its mark every winter, each cold breath triggering a scratch in his throat that carried him back to the Atlantic. Doctors called it chronic irritation. He knew better. It was a reminder of the days when the sea swallowed his convoy whole and the air around him turned into something that blurred steel, sky, and human lungs without distinction. Dr. Harold Whitcombe carried a different weight. Though never named publicly, he was questioned after the war about the project's design, its purpose, and the health reports that followed. His surviving notebooks, found decades later in an Admiralty archive, show a man who understood exactly what he had created. In one margin he wrote, "Camouflage is not the danger, prolonged exposure is." It was as close to an admission as he ever made. The British government quietly shuttered the program. The fog generators were dismantled, their parts reassigned or destroyed. The reflective coatings were reformulated for safer uses. The files were boxed, stamped, restricted, and stored where only archivists would ever see them. Official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic make no mention of ships that turned into ghosts or sailors who breathed poison in the name of survival. The tactic worked, too well, and was buried before its legacy could spread. But for the men who lived inside that vanishing fog, the memory never drifted away. It lingered, thin as mist, long after the war had passed them by.